Thank you, everyone. It's a great honor to be here, to be part of the Lehr House programming. And it's so wonderful to collaborate between the Ashman Family JCC and Lehr House. It's even an honor to be the Siyum, Chazak Venitchazek, the last lecture, if I understand correctly. So it's a big honor. And it's really wonderful to have everyone here on the screen. I would want to ask if you're comfortable turning on your camera. That would be really nice. The reason I'm suggesting that is because for those of you who know me, I love conversations. I love to hear input from the participants and not only to lecture. And a lot of people here have a lot to say. And I'm saying that very intentionally. Some of us think that if we don't know about a subject, we're not entitled to participate in the conversation. But I want to challenge that premise and to say that we all have a lot to contribute to any conversation, really. And especially today, when I'm going to try to tell a story of change, we all know what change is in different contexts. And we're all concerned about different things. And we all think we know how we might want to fix things. So I want to start by inviting everyone to join the conversation. And the context will be change in Israel in the last 10 years, but really it's about any social change that we are experiencing and living every day. So as Professor Bill introduced me, I work for the Ashman Family JCC. I'm the Director of Jewish Content. I'm also a faculty member in the Mandel Institute, where we train educators, both in Israel and in the United States. And also, I'm an Israeli. And that's my second statement as I start, is what I'm about to present today is really from my own personal perspective. I'm a Jewish educator. I do theater, but I'm not a political scientist and I'm not a sociologist. I'm just someone who really loves Israel and read the news. And basically that is my perspective on Israel. And that is why I'm going to tell the story from only my own perspective. And that is why I'm inviting everyone to share your own, because that's the fun part. So I'm going to share my screen and start telling a story. And the story is about change. And what I want to do is basically to try to draw a line from 2011 to 2021. In those 2 years, 10 years are separating between two very important experiences that happened to Israeli society. And I want to start with this. This is me 10 years ago. This is in Rishikesh, India, with some friends. I went on a month's journey in India in 2011. That was 10 years ago, with some friends. And I got an email from a good friend saying, Tovah, what are you doing in India? You are missing out. You are missing a historical event. We are demonstrating in Israel, all over Israel, and we are changing Israel to the core. You have to come back. And literally, I felt that I'm missing a very big event that is happening. And this is basically what I missed. I missed the tent protest. The tent protest started in July 2021. It went on for a few months, and it was an unprecedented event. It started with those four people that you see in the bottom of the slide: Stav Shafir, Regev Kontes, Daphne Leaf, and Itzik Shmuli. They were students. They couldn't rent an apartment in Tel Aviv. And they, as a protest, started putting out tents in Tel Aviv. The bottom left is Rothschild Avenue in Tel Aviv. And they said, I cannot get an apartment, I cannot get a job, and we need justice. And in days, Israel, all over Israel, in the main piazzas, is the main centers, were filled with tents. And before I explain more, I want to show you, I'm going to stop share. I'm going to show you a short piece that was on television 10 years ago. So in order to do that, I will go to see. Okay. I'm going to share my screen again. Sorry, I wanted to try to make it more elegant, but this would do. Okay, it's very short.
It's an unlikely scene in one of Tel Aviv's affluent neighborhoods. Since mid-July, makeshift camps like this one have sprung up throughout the country as young Israelis demand a solution to a housing crisis, which has seen many of them priced out of the market.
I can't buy a house in Tel Aviv or anywhere else. It's impossible. If half of your salary goes towards paying rent, and you also need to cover taxes, bills, and food, it's impossible to put anything aside to invest. And that's when you don't even have a husband and children, because after that, it gets even more complicated.
Over just 1 year, the average price of housing increased by 32% in Tel Aviv and 17% in Jerusalem. In recent weeks, tens of thousands of demonstrators, dubbed the outraged Israelis, have taken to the streets, marching through Israel's largest cities. Economic growth in Israel has averaged 4.5% since 2004, but people here are fed up of the growing social disparity.
The middle class in Israel is exploding. It took a while, but the explosion is finally happening. The people protesting are from different social and political backgrounds. I've never seen such a variety.
And the protests are growing in size. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced on Tuesday an emergency plan that includes the construction of 50,000 new homes. But he is facing increasing pressure every day.
Okay. Stop share. Let's see. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I'm going to talk more about the tent protest that started 10 years ago, but I want to kind of listen to you. You saw the pictures, you saw the short video. What comes to mind? We are a pretty small group, so it's an advantage because we can just unmute and share. So what came to mind when you saw the video and the pictures?
It looked like the 10 cities we see now in San Francisco of homeless people. And elsewhere, not just San Francisco.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was it at the same time when we had Occupy Wall Street and other Occupy events? How does it relate time-wise? I'm trying to remember.
Mhm.
Was, I don't know if anybody remembered when Occupy took place. Was it perceived as driven internationally, or was it like only Israeli centered and, not connected to other places?
Mhm. It's a very good question. It's a very good question.
I had the same thought. I seem to recall it was happening around the same time as the Occupy movement. And my thought is, and what I'm interested to see where you go with this, because my thought was that Occupy just kind of died off and didn't really do anything.
Yeah.
And my sense was, although I didn't follow it as closely at the time, that it's similar to what happened in Tel Aviv. So if you're drawing a link between what's happened now to what happened then, I'm really curious to see that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Tovah. We miss you.
Yeah.
So for us, that brings a lot of memories back, because we lived in Israel then, and we were those people who couldn't pay the rent. And it was this feeling of like, you thought it was your fault and something was wrong with you. And suddenly you were like, oh my God, it's not just me. This is something bigger than that. It's not that something is wrong with me. And, I know my kids wanted to move. I was pregnant, so I didn't want to sleep in a tent, but we schlepped our kids to the protests, and one of my kids wanted to move into a tent so he didn't have to share a room with his two other siblings in our 2-bedroom little house we couldn't afford. So but a lot of memories of feeling like we could change things, and that finally there was a sense of hope.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. So I will address how it is perceived from some perspective. And definitely there was kind of a world movement. And the young people who started that basically were pretty, I would say, cosmopolitan people. Most of them were journalists and students. Itzik Shmuli was the head of the Students' Union. And Daphne Regev and Stav learned her academic studies in London. So definitely there was a global movement that influenced it. And the main pieces that this protest was about, I hope you can see my screen. So it was cost of living, as you saw, housing. It was early childhood education. Up until then, early childhood education. So education was subsidized only from the age of 5, from Gan Chova, which is age of 5. And part of this protest was young parents taking their kids in strollers. It was also called the strollers protest because it was thousands and thousands of young parents taking their kids in strollers. Maybe you remember that as well, Tamar. As I said, I missed it because I was in India.
I guess we remember.
And also welfare issues. So I'm kind of lining all the main issues here because we're going to see what happened to those issues. But definitely it was about those issues. It was a middle class protest. It was a protest of young people, relatively young people. And what I want to do now, I want to jump 10 years. I want to jump 10 years to the Balfour protest. And I want to make some connections and some comparison between the two protests, the issues, the results, and then we will go back. So the Balfour protest was it started actually when the pandemic started. It was when Israel was about to have a third and then a fourth election. And it was not in Tel Aviv, it was in Jerusalem. So the Balfour protest was next to the official housing of Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I want us to see another very short video of that, and then we're going to talk about the two protests and then what happened in between. So I'm sorry that the moving between the different parts is not so elegant, but I hope it will be worth it. So now let's see another video.
Next week, we're gonna do this all over again. Doesn't matter, a twisted ankle, a broken leg, or a broken head. I'm still gonna come here until Benjamin Netanyahu will go home.
Okay. So I'm going to talk more about that, but again, I want your fresh impressions. What did you see? What did you see? And in what way do you feel it's different than the one 10 years before?
I just had a question that maybe will come up, and that is, how long did each protest last? If, you know, the tents were there for quite a while, and in my understanding is the Balfour protests, at least for some people, were happening like weekly until the election. So for me, the biggest difference is the tents were, for lack of a better term, permanent or ongoing, where the Balfour protests were reoccurring on a weekly basis, and that in and of itself is a difference.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Frank. So the tent protest, I would say the official part of it was around 3 months. So the main centers with tents were kind of, they were gone after in September, around September 2011. There were many attempts to reignite that protest, but basically it was around 3 months. And yes, the Balfour protests were more than a year, and they went on week after week, every Motzei Shabbat, and people came to Jerusalem from the far north and the far south. A lot of people came from Tel Aviv, and there was a whole debate about where to do it, and there was a very conscious decision to do it in Jerusalem. So yes, one big difference is definitely the length. Beautiful, thank you. What else? And again, you don't need to have any prior knowledge, just for what you just saw, and then we will see more details.
It looks like there was, you know, army responding to the Balfour protests, and that the protesters were depicted as, or at least taken by the government to be, you know, deserving of state response, whereas like the tent protests, it doesn't look like there was force brought in, but I'm looking at 2 small videos.
Yes, definitely the Balfour protest was much more violent. Police was very present, much more present. There were some police and some violence in the tent protest, but definitely it was much peaceful, because as Frank said, people were just there. They were just living there, and there was a lot of media coming there. But the weekly demonstrations in Balfour, which, as I said, is close to the residence of Netanyahu, they were pretty violent. People got arrested, and the footage that we have from those days are pretty disturbing. So definitely that's another big difference. Thank you, Alisa. Beautiful. What else?
It seems to me that the first protest was more of a social protest, and the second was very much a countrywide political protest against corruption and Netanyahu in particular. But there's also the possibility that that social protest 10 years before added to the fire of the protest 10 years later,
Yeah.
which became a much broader political protest.
Yeah. So please.
I was just going to say that agendas are somewhat different. The first protest agenda was so broad. I mean, to address that agenda, you would need to have dozens of different policies, right? But the agenda for the second one was so narrow, so pointed. Just get out that government, right? I mean, transfer power. It's much, very narrow, very pointed, and maybe because of that, there was more energy in it versus going, you know, with a whole list of things to change.
Beautiful, beautiful. So if you read today interviews with people who were in both protests, they said that they learned a few things. And they said in the first protest, it was like very, as you said, broad messages about social justice. And those people who were 10 years older and also in a different life stage, a lot of things were different, but also Israel was different. They said, we want one thing. We want a change of government. We want a change of leadership. And the message was very clear. And let me show you how exactly that was. So these were the main issues. So first of all, this protest was very personal. It was about the prime minister. And it was the prime minister's trials. We know that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is facing a few trials that have to do with corruption, one with being involved in a very big media organization in Israel, Walla. One has to do with submarines that were sold, that were bought from Egypt, and there's a big deal around that. And there's a trial around misconduct in the, like using the privileges of living in the official residence of the prime minister and other. And those trials were really part of the protest. And a lot of people said, one of the organizations, En Matzav, there's no way, En Matzav שמואשם בפלילים יהיה ראש ממשלה. There is no way that someone who is facing a trial can be a prime minister. That was one of the very, very big messages. Another piece was the natural gas. Just a few years before, there were sources of natural gas that were discovered, and there was a big, big, big debate about how this wealth is going to be distributed, and another big conversation about corruption around that. The pandemic, although if you ask leaders around the world, you would say that might say that Israel was dealing with it like in a phenomenal way, but the conversation in Israel was really about how people were not getting the financial support, and people were in very bad shape, mostly financially. The political crisis, because Israel was facing a third and a fourth election And each election, it was like half and half, and it felt like stuck. That was a really, really big frustration for Israelis. And this is another thing that I want to mention, police violence. We talked about police violence within those protests, but it is important to note that prior to the Balfour protests, there were at least two very, very disturbing incidents. One is the murder of Salomon Teka. He's an Ethiopian Israeli who was shot by a police officer. Sounds very, very unfortunately familiar. And that was really part of the frustration against the police, against the law enforcement. And also Iyad El-Khalek, who is a Palestinian young person who was shot in Jerusalem. Also, both those two incidents really created. So there are very specific big issues that started this protest. And again, if I want to kind of compare, so there's Tel Aviv versus Jerusalem, wide range of issues versus very specific and very personal issues. One important thing to acknowledge is that if the tent protest was literally led by a few young people, Stav Shafir, Daphne Leaf, we will come back to Stav Shafir in a few minutes. Here, it was a very different thing. I'm trying to go to my next slide. 1 second. Sorry that it's not very smooth. Okay. I'm going to the next.
Why was it called the Balfour protest?
The Balfour protest, because it was in Balfour Street, which is where the official residence of the Prime Minister.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm trying to find you. I don't know why I can't find you. Okay, there you are. I don't know why. I don't know why it's not letting me.
Tovah, it's possible that your PowerPoint is on a large screen and you need to minimize it in order to see it. In other words, you need it to be on your desktop.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is on my desktop, but I will just, I don't know why it's not letting me open the Zoom again. I'm sorry about that. Okay, I don't know why.
We're all used to Zoom technical problems, so we're all patient.
Sorry. It's not letting me open the Zoom window from some reason. Sorry about that. Okay, now I see you. I'm sorry. Okay. I hope now you can see my screen. So these are the leaders. You see my screen? Okay. I see Tamar and Michael nodding, so I'm counting on you. So these are some of the faces. And again, we're creating those comparisons in order to learn something about change. But one very important thing to acknowledge about the difference between the two protests is that this time it wasn't a group of individuals, it was a group of organizations. And yes, for each organization, there were faces. So for example, on the top left, you see Amir Haskel. He started En Matzav, there is no way, or unacceptable. And Amir Haskel was in veteran in the IDF. He was in the Israeli Air Force for many, many years. On the top right, Shikma Bressler. She's a physician, physicist, physicist in a Weizmann Institute in Rehovot. She's a mother of 5, and she started the Black Flags movement. And on the bottom left, you see Yishai Hadass. He's a journalist and a TV producer. He started Crime Minister. Crime Minister's organization is really about the trials. And on the bottom right, you see the journalist Orly Barlev. Orly Barlev is an independent journalist who covered the protest from a very, very passionate and very specific agenda. So what is interesting is that those organizations never tried to unite. That was another thing that they learned from the tent protest. They did not try to have one message. Each one of those organizations had its own message. There were dozens of organizations. There was an organization of the Atzmaim, the self-employed. There was organizations of the parents, the organization of the teachers, and each one had their own messages, and they all collaborated just by coming on the same time to the same place. That's it. They had their logos, they had their flags, and that actually happened to be very, very helpful strategically because it spread very quickly all over Israel. For example, the Black Flags, their initiative was while the main protest happened in Balfour, in Jerusalem, next to Balfour, the main place was Paris Square in Jerusalem, Kikar Paris. People all over Israel were protesting on the bridges. So you saw hundreds of bridges around Israel, people holding Israeli flags and Black flags, for example. So there were different strategies, different messages, but there was collaboration, not unification, which is very, very interesting. So that's another interesting way to talk about the differences. I will mention very quickly 3 more differences between the tent protest in 2011 and the Balfour protest in 2021. You see quite a few Jewish messages, which is another very interesting thing. In one of the pictures one of the photos here, and that I will show you, you will see the 10 Commandments. And the reason I chose to show it is because many times in Israel, in the discourse about social justice and the discourse about equality, the discourse about democracy, this discourse is very secular. And the camps that advocate for those issues mostly, typically, would not use Jewish language. And this is because the way Israeli politics works, unfortunately, it's changing rapidly, but the liberal camps do not identify many times with the Jewish language, because the Jewish language is perceived to be part of the Orthodox community. And the Orthodox community usually advocates for more particularistic issues. Here it's different. Balfour used to have Kabbalat Shabbat on Friday afternoon, and that was every week. There was Kabbalat Shabbat on Friday afternoon, then the protest would stop and continue after Shabbat, which is a really big deal. Having this solidarity between different communities in Israel, saying that this protest is apolitical, this protest is wide range, and we want everyone to be able to participate, especially if you need to take the bus or the car to Jerusalem. And here, when talking about social justice, you see the 10 Commandments, really something unique that you did not see in the protest 10 years ago. And many organizations since the 10th protest really started adopting Jewish language, adopting Jewish quotes, saying we can be very connected to our heritage, to our tradition. We can actually be inspired by our tradition in order to create justice in the world. And this is very much influenced from American Judaism. We need to say that. It is important to say that because, for example, in organizations like Bina, who started bringing this language into the social justice field, it influenced directly from American Judaism and the concept of Tikkun Olam. So that's a really big change. Lastly, this protest was global, meaning that Israelis from all over the world protested. And that it's a huge precedent. It's a huge precedent because in the last 10 years, as you see on the bottom left, that's in, I don't know, it's somewhere, maybe it's in DC. And you can see some people from our community, Rachel Batish and Ophir Gutelzon. Ophir Gutelzon from our community is really one of the leaders of the parallel organization to En Matzav, Unacceptable. And basically they said, we are Israelis, we love Israel, we're not apologizing for living outside of Israel. Our families are in Israel, our businesses are in Israel, and we are going to protest from wherever we are. So when Israelis were on the bridges in Haifa and in Beersheba and in Tel Aviv, some of us as friends, we went to the Golden Gate in San Francisco, and the Israelis in DC, the Israelis in Paris, in Italy, and different places. And that is a big change that happened to Israeli society outside of Israel, really accepting that there is an Israeli diaspora. This is a huge change that happened in the last few years. It's very, very new. But for Israelis to stand outside of Israel and to say, I am here, but I am entitled and obligated to influence what happens in Israel. It's completely new, and I think it will have more and more influence in the future, but this is really something to acknowledge. Deborah, I see that you're raising your hand. Can you unmute yourself, Deborah? We still can.
Here. Okay, here. No, I was just thinking, I have never visited Israel. My health would make that very hard to do for a very long period of time, tragically. But my father was a fundraiser for UJA. My uncle raised funds for Weitzman and lots of other organizations. My mother worked for Jewish Family Service, etc. That was my world in many ways. And so I've grown up with this very kind of idealistic belief about Israel. And obviously life and people are much more complex than that in all kinds of ways. But it sounds finally as if there's some kind of moral protest that has to do at least with our ideals. And that's a source of a great, I can't even find the words for it, what it means, you know, at long last, this was a country that was supposed to have values, just as the United States does. And finally are tackling the problem of values. You know, Israel's grown big enough and wealthy enough and successful enough. Okay, folks, let's get back to what we were meant to do, even though it was corruption from the beginning.
Beautiful. It really moves me to listen to your words, Deborah, because I think these kind of conversations, the one that we are having right now, really helps us understand how in many ways we're very similar, as we are now mourning the relationship between American Jews and Israel, and we're really talking about this chasm and this split. The more we learn about each other, the more we learn about the people, the more we learn about the fabric of society, we really get to see that a lot of people just really want to create good in the world. And it can help us understand how we can help each other, literally. So it's beautiful. Thank you. I really appreciate you said that. Okay. So basically what we did, we looked at the tent process in 2011, tent protest. We looked at the Balfour protest. One thing that I haven't mentioned about Balfour, that it was very, very artistic. It was fun. It was just fun. A lot of artists, if you look, just Google the footage that you have, it's just really, really talented people doing different installations and music performances, as you see on the top left. So it's also different. It's different because it celebrated life, and it celebrated how life should and can be in many, many ways. So that's just an interesting thing to acknowledge. Okay, so this is what I want to show you now. I want to show you now the results, basically, very simple. The results of the protest. And again, as I said, I'm not a political scientist, and some people could argue that it's not really result of the protest, but I want to talk about the change government. And I'm trying, as you see, I'm trying to share my screen and to go to the next slide, but I don't know why it's not moving. Oh my God. This is not what I need. I don't know. Okay. All right. So in a summer of 2021, July 2021, a new government was formed. And this was a new government that was the fourth election in 2 years. And the prime ministers, I'm saying because it's a rotation government, 2 years Naftali Bennett, 2 years Yair Lapid. And those are new prime ministers after 12 years of Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu was a prime minister for 15 years, from 96 to 99, and then from 2000 and something doesn't work, doesn't add up, but he was from 2009 until 2021. And this is the new government. And basically this government is called the change government because of different reasons. And the main thing is that this government is very, very broad. If you see the bottom, there's a list of all the political parties. Some you will recognize, some are new because those parties keep coming up. And as you know, the political system in Israel is very different than the one in the United States. And it is very hard sometimes to understand. And many times people after the election say, okay, so who won? But it takes time to really form a coalition. And the one that gets to form a coalition is the one who wins. And sometimes it takes months and months. So after the election, Netanyahu tried to form a coalition. He wasn't successful. And then the mandate was given to Bennett and Lapid from, as you see in the middle, it's the president, Ruby Rivlin. Now we have a new president who is Isaac Herzog. And this is a new government. Some faces you know, some faces are new. And this government is unprecedented. And I will tell you why. I will go to the next slide and I'll share with you why it is a very, very, very different government. If I can change this slide. Okay. So the reason why it is such a different government is, first of all, as I'm sure you saw right away, there are many more women. Again, 9 out of 27, it's only 1/3. And I'm saying only because if you compare to other countries, it's not the best, but it's more than before. Also, an Arab Independent Party is part of the coalition, which is unprecedented. The joint list, the Reshima Meshutefet, is an Arab-Israeli political party. And it is even more extraordinary knowing that the prime minister now is an Orthodox Jew. He's kippah-wearing Jew, Naftali Bennett. And you see that we have 5 Orthodox Jews, we have 1 Muslim Arab, and we have 1 Druze, and we have 5 Olim, 5 Olim, people who were not born in Israel. 2 of them from former Soviet Union and 1 from Ethiopia. And lastly, we were used to seeing the government being formed by basically the head of the biggest party. And in this case, it's different. In this case, the person who formed the government, Bennett, is a head of Yamina who only had 6 seats in the Knesset. How exactly is that possible? We can talk about that, but that's a very big change. So what advantages, and here, as you see, I have an agenda. What advantages can be to that kind of a government? No prior knowledge needed to kind of try to guess. Why is this, at least in my opinion, a positive change?
Netanyahu is not in it.
Okay, that's one. Some would say that's one advantage. Yes. Thank you, David.
It's more diverse. Maybe it's representing the country more, a mirror of the country's population more accurately.
Exactly. And this is rare because for years and years and years and years, there was a coalition of right wing, and the right wing was accompanied many times, mostly by the Orthodox political parties. And then the left wing with the more secular I would say, and the Arab political parties, and then one of them was in the government and the other was not basically represented. So that's a very, very important advantage. What else do you think? Well, many more women, and many more women means many issues that really were took to the side, were taken to the side, are now in the center. And you see that, and now you can read the headlines of every day. You can see what's in the headlines. And up until now, and we're almost an hour into the conversation, we haven't talked at all about the conflict. We haven't talked at all about the political situation between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And we know that the main topic of the elections, every election was about that, was about security and the conflict. And this election was different. So when Bennett gave his inaugural speech, he talked about the Palestinian issue, but he also talked about education, welfare, transportation. He talked about housing. He talked about the Arab-Israeli society. So all these things were in the focus of his speech, and that is a big, big, big change. So now, basically, in the last 30 minutes of our talk, my job is to try to show you that the tent protest really had an influence on all this, that the tent protest did influence until the Balfour protest, and then that influenced the change government. And I'm going to do that through 3 parameters. One is the actual results of the tent protest. Second is through the people. I'm going to focus on one person, Stav Shafir. And the third one is the civic society and the activism that came from the people. Those are the 3 things that I want to show how in 10 years, things changed. Things changed dramatically, I would say. So after the during the protests, there was a very important committee that was created, the Trachtenberg Committee. Trachtenberg was an economist. He's a very, very nice guy from Argentina. And later he became a member of Knesset. All the heroes were members of Knesset in the end, including Stav Shafir and Itzik Shmuli. I will talk about them. But at that time, he was basically the head of the budget committee that had to do with the academia, with the higher studies. And Netanyahu, in order to really try to address some of the demands of the protesters in the tent protest, basically formed this committee, the Trachtenberg Committee. And the committee was supposed to look at those things, proposals to change priorities in order to lighten the load of Israeli citizens, and mostly, as you remember, we talked about middle class young people. That was the main focus. Implementation of new taxation system, same thing. Providing access to social services, increasing competition in the Israeli economy, and actual measures to reduce housing prices. All these things sound kind of straightforward, kind of technical, and Trachtenberg very, very quickly, in just a few weeks, had his recommendations. There were different pieces of it, but 2 things actually were implemented very quickly. One, early childhood education, and that is something that you can say very explicitly that the tent protest was successful in that thing. So education is subsidized by the state from age 3 in Israel. And that happened 10 years ago. And those young moms with strollers like Tamar and Michael, who walked with the strollers, they were successful. No, you're not enjoying it now. I mean, I don't know where you are now. I know that you're running around, but I hope a lot of people are enjoying it now, having that for their kids from age 3, and we know how significant it is. And another huge change is employment within Arab and Haredi communities. And employment within those communities also mean education. And in the last 10 years, there were many academic programs, especially for those communities. And again, it's hard to prove it, but one can definitely see a connection between that piece and the much more diverse government that we have today. So that is that. Other things that Trachtenberg tried to work on weren't really helpful, weren't really implemented. And basically, the general feeling of those young people from 10 years ago was that they failed. And if you talk to them now, maybe now they would talk differently, but for 10 years, this protest was eulogized as, yes, it was very naive, it was very nice, it was like a fantasy of a few hippies. But if you can really see, especially when thinking about specific communities, that actually gained from there. So that is one thing. I want to talk about Stav. Stav Shafir, you saw her picture in the first slide. Stav Shafir, she was one of the leaders of the protest. We need to say that the person who started it is Daphne Leaf. Daphne Leaf is a film director. She basically started a Facebook event 10 years ago. Now we don't do Facebook events anymore. It's not like something that you do today. There's Instagram, there's other things, but back then it was very impactful. She started a Facebook event. I'm going to put a tent in the end of Rothschild Boulevard next to Habima. Come join me. And Stav Shafir joined her. So Stav Shafir, 2 years after the protest, became a member of Knesset at age 27. She was the youngest member of Knesset ever. And since then, she was in a few terms of the Knesset through the Labor Party and then through the Zionist Camp Party. Then she started another party, the Green Party. Now she's not a member of Knesset, but she was a member of Knesset for many years. And also Itzik Shmuli, another person, he also became a member of Knesset. And some people criticize them for that. It's important to know. Some people criticize them for that. Stav Shafir, when she was in the Knesset, she started the Transparency Committee, Vadat Hashkifut. Transparency Committee, again, we talked about the global influence. She learned that from other parliaments in Europe, where there is a Transparency Committee, basically saying that money that goes from one place to another needs documentation, needs to have policy, there should be ways, though the people should know where the money goes. And she really was like a whistleblower on a lot of very disturbing things. Not a lot changed, unfortunately, but she was really the fighter. And I want to show you a video of Stav, very young. I think the video is from 2015, so she was 30. And just you can see how she brings a very new, fresh voice to the Parliament of Israel. So I'm going to share my screen again. Let's hope it's gonna work.
חברים, חבריי מהימין, הפחד ניכר מעיניכם. אתם פשוט מפחדים. אתם מפחדים בגלל שבשנתיים האחרונות חשפנו את השחיתויות שלכם. חשפנו איך מאחורי המעטה האידיאולוגי אתם לקחתם את כספי הציבור הישראלי, את כספי המיסים שהציבור עבד כל כך קשה בשבילם, והעברתם אותם לחברים שלכם, לחלוקת ג'ובים, למקורבים, לפעילים, לעמותות פרטיות. איך מפלגת הבית היהודי, שמעמידה פנים שהיא יותר ציונית מבן גוריון, איך המפלגה הזאת לקחה את כספי הציבור, ובמקום להעביר אותם למפעלים הקורסים בפריפריה, במקום להעביר אותם לפרי גליל ולערד, במקום להעביר אותם לבתי החולים כדי להגדיל את כמות המיטות, במקום ללכת ולרווח את כיתות הלימוד, במקום לעשות פה תחבורה ציבורית מצוינת, לקחתם את הכסף שלנו וזרקתם אותו, חילקתם אותו במתנה לחברים שלכם, לעמותות פרטיות שבראשן עומדים אנשי הבית היהודי. איפה נפתלי בנט שיגיב על הפרשה של העברת מענק של 36 מיליון שקלים לעמותת מועצת יש"ע בשעה שהוא עמד בראשה ובאופן לא חוקי דרך ועדת כספים? איפה? תגיבו ותענו, אל תתווכחו איתנו על הציונות, כי ציונות אמיתית, חברים, זה לחלק את התקציב באופן שווה בין כל אזרחי המדינה. ציונות אמיתית זה לדאוג לחלשים, ציונות אמיתית זה סולידריות, לא רק בקרב, אלא ביום-יום, לשמור אחד על השני. זו ישראליות, זו ציונות. לדאוג לעתידם של אזרחי ישראל, בבית החולים, בבית הספר, בכבישים, ברווחה, זו ציונות. ואתם לוקחים ומחריבים אותה. אתם לוקחים והופכים את הקופה הציבורית לסחר מחר, לקומבינה פוליטית בידיים שלכם, במקום לדאוג למדינה. אתם שכחתם מהנגב ומהגליל כדי להעביר 1.2 מיליארד שקלים להתנחלויות בבונוסים. אתם שכחתם את ישראל, אתם איבדתם את הציונות כבר מזמן. חברים, כשאנחנו שרים את התקווה, אנחנו שרים אותה ומצייתים באמת להוראה של ההמנון. תקווה, פוליטיקה של תקווה, פוליטיקה שיש בה עתיד, פוליטיקה שמסתכלת קדימה ורוצה לעשות את החיים פה טובים יותר, בטוחים יותר, שרוצה לעשות שלום, שרוצה לתקן את היחסים הראויים בין החלקים השונים בחברה הישראלית, שמאמינה בשוויון זכויות, בשוויון תקציבי, שחושבת שלכל אזרח ישראלי מגיע לקבל שווה בשווה, מגיע לחיות פה חיים טובים באמת. זו הציונות האמיתית, זו התקווה. אם נתניהו היה כותב את המנון המדינה, כנראה שהיה צריך לקרוא לזה המנון הייאוש. נגד הפוליטיקה שלכם אנחנו נלחמים, נגד ההכפשות ונגד השקרים, ובעד פוליטיקה של תקווה, של עתיד, של טוב.
תודה לחברת הכנסת.
Thoughts? This was 2015. That's 4 years after. She's already 2 years a member of Knesset. What do you think?
I have to tell a joke. It may seem inappropriate, but it may seem right on.
Please.
This was told by Carol Notman. Carol Notman was the first woman president of the American Psychiatric Association, and a wonderful, remarkable person and friend. And she told this joke, and that was a group of people were sitting around watching a football game on a Sunday afternoon. The men were all drinking beer and sitting there, and the chips had run out and the dips had run out. And the men were not doing anything. They're just sitting there kind of looking at the empty bowls. The women all got up and went into the kitchen and had a wonderful time together cooking up food. And I'm hearing so many things. The terrible, and I don't mean this as a misogynist by any means, but or misandrist, but the male-dominated Jewish society for ever so long that Israel inherited, with all Judaism, with how it's continued, with the tremendous changes that are hopefully beginning to happen with women actually building and participating and cooking together instead of the corruption and the rigidity that was so present. And Malk and Carol Notman did something that took longer than landing a man on the moon. She became the first female president of the American Psychiatric Association. So it says something about how distorted, tragically, all countries are. Certainly the United States is. It's changing too. But this distortion and bias that Israel began with is finally shifting and becoming a society instead of, I don't know what else to call it.
Thank you, Deborah. So, that alludes to the one piece that we shared about the change government, that it has many more women. And definitely we can have a whole conversation about the gender piece. And when Bennett and Lapid formed their government and they signed all those coalition agreements, Bennett really highlighted the person, unfortunately, I don't remember her name, but the person who was actually the person who crafted everything. And she speaks about how much patience she needed and how she did it. And that tells the whole story. And I can share it with you on email, how she tells the story of how she formed it. And definitely the gender piece is at play here. What else did you think when you heard Stav?
Well, it's interesting. She called out Naftali Bennett by name for his corrupt practices, and yet here he is in this new government and theoretically leading the charge away from that kind of behavior.
People have very short memory, right? Yeah, absolutely. Beautiful. Thank you for noticing that.
So other practical specific examples, that was a very fiery speech, right? And it was really, I personally like it because it was so concrete. I mean, there was some concrete things. So those things that she called out, were there any reforms or changes or, little shifts? Can you talk to that?
Yes. So there's a few things. The third thing and the last thing that I'm actually going to name and show is a relationship between religion and state. So that has to do with what Stav is saying. So Stav is saying a few things. She's talking about the settlement movement that is really taking a lot of the resources. And she's basically saying that the settlement movement is taking a lot of resources. Maybe, but the process is not right. The process is corrupt. So she's calling that out. But she's also talking about right-wing and religious political parties kind of in the same bucket. So again, Israeli politics has a lot of history around alignment of right-wing and religious Orthodox parties together. But I want to kind of shine a light on another slow but actually pretty fast process that Israeli society is going through in the last 10 years. It's been going on for decades, but I think it's kind of fast forward in the last 10 years, which is the relationship between religion and state. And I'm going to show three examples. Yes, sorry. I'm going to show three examples of how religion and state basically has been through a very interesting process. So I'm starting with a few anecdotes. One is 2012, where a new project started. This new project is called Hashgacha Pratit. השגחה פרטית. It's a word play, but it's basically taking the whole notion of kosher food out of the hands of the rabbinate. This is one part of a very long journey of basically taking pieces by pieces, different pieces of authority from the Rabbanut. The Rabbanut is the religious organization, which is a governmental organization that deals with specific administrative issues in the state of Israel that has to do with kosher food, that has to do with marriage, that has to do with burial, that has to do some education. So this very, very brave and creative guy, Rabbi Aaron Leibovich, he was, we hosted him, Amitai, my colleague, hosted him in Palo Alto like a year ago. He started a private organization that basically tried to substitute the Rabbanut. People who had a business, a food business, that wanted to have a kosher certificate, but did not want to do it through the rabbinate, because the rabbinate had a lot of issues of corruption. The rabbinate took a lot of money, and basically they created an alternative called Hashgacha Pratit, saying that these businesses can get the certificate with a lot cheaper, and in a way that people can say, okay, I know this certificate is not an official governmental one, but I trust this. So that started by a group of people, not only Rabbi Leibovich, also member of Knesset Rachel Azaria started it, and also one person that many of us know, Yael Yechieli, was in that group, Chaya Gilboa, a member of Knesset Tehila Friedman. Those names are familiar to some of you. It was a group, it started in 2012, and that's just one example. Another example, in 2015, in Jerusalem, a group of people started an organization called Shabbos. Shabbos, maybe to some of you it sounds like Shabbos, like Shabbat, and then also bus, like bus, like autobus, like bus. Basically, it's a way for people to get from one place to another on Shabbat, because Israel does not have a separation between religion and state, and some things are the administrative way, it's basically a religious way. So public transportation, no public transportation on Shabbat. And this has been this case since the inception of the State of Israel, and people who do not have a private car cannot basically go and see the grandmother, take a morning on the beach if they don't have a car. And, either they have to use a taxi or just stay home. And it's not really a religious issue, it's a social justice issue, because the less privileged communities basically pay the price. So in 2015, the first organization started it in Jerusalem, Shabbos, and then another organization, Noah Tanua. It's all fun wordplay in Hebrew. The left one is the head of the municipality of Tel Aviv, the mayor of Tel Aviv, Ron Huldai. He also started, and that's basically having young people who go partying on Friday night to have a safe way to get home, or families to be able to go and enjoy nature on Saturday. And that started 2015. It was a really, really big deal. And again, it's private people, private companies that kind of decided, okay, we're going to take it and just do it. And then municipalities, whole municipalities took that on because they do have the authority to do that. And now it's basically something that you can see a lot. And today, the Minister of Transportation, Merav Michaeli, is officially working on public transportation on Shabbat. That was one of her first statements when she started. She's working on that. And that's a very, very dramatic change. Mallory, I see that your hand is up.
I was just curious. So this change of transportation seems very much like, okay, we're not happy with what the government had decided based on the rabbinute overseeing this decision. And so we're going to take it into our own hands and we're going to go around the government and we're going to do something different, which is provide transportation on Shabbat. I was curious though about the previous example where that rabbi and a group decided to offer kosher certification of sorts. Why would they want to do that if the rabbinate is already available to take care of that? Like, what's the end goal by going around the rabbinate in that example?
It's a great question. So it will also connect to the last piece that I will show, which is about marriages. So the Rabbanut does offer a way to have a kosher certification. The Rabbanut does offer a way to get married, but there is a very, very high price and a lot of limitations around that. First of all, money. If you have a restaurant and you want to get a kosher certification from the Rabbanut, it's just very, very expensive. And many times there are other limitations. For example, you have to be closed on Shabbat. It has nothing to do with the kosherness of the food and other things. So this private organization is trying to really make it more accessible, because a lot of businesses are kosher and a lot of businesses, people trust them and know they're kosher. So they just want to find a way to manage that, to make it more accessible. With the marriages, it's a very, very complicated issue, because if a man and a woman in Israel who are Jewish want to get married, great. They have a way to get married. They can get married in the Rabbanut. If it is a man and a woman that are part of the Islamic community or the Christian community, if both partners are part of the same religion, they have a way to get married. If it is a Jewish person and a Muslim person, for example, if it's a person who cannot prove their Judaism from different reasons, if it's a man and a man, a woman and a woman, they do not have, technically, they do not have a way to get married. So a lot of people who do have the possibility to get married, because they're both Jewish, they're male and female, choose not to because other people cannot get married. And in Israel, there is no civil marriage. So that's another example that we're going to see today, how these things are changing. And I will show you a few organizations that are doing this very, very revolutionary work. So the time stamp that I wanted to put here is 2018. Why? Because on 2018, Rabbi Dov Chayun, the really nice guy that you see here, got arrested at 5:30 a.m. in his house in Haifa. And the reason is that he officiated a wedding that is not a wedding of the Rabbanut. He's a conservative rabbi. And basically, people who officiate weddings outside of the Rabbanut in Israel are basically criminals till this day. And this wasn't really enforced in any way, but from some reason, that morning it was, and he got arrested. And that really started the whole conversation that already existed before. So here there is an organization called Israel Chofshit, Free Israel. There's an organization called Chupot. Other organizations, like here you see the logos of the conservative movement and the reform movement. There are a lot of movements that officiate alternative, you can say, weddings. They're very Jewish weddings. Many weddings are like very Jewish, but are not part of the Rabbanut. And if you look at the numbers, and I couldn't find like a really, really good chart, but if you look at the numbers, you see in the last 10 years that the people who decide not to get married through the Rabbanut is increasing every year. Some people choose to get married outside of Israel because ironically, if you get married in a random city hall outside of Israel, it will be recognized in Israel. So you can go and get married outside of Israel. It's called Cyprus marriage. People just do a whole package in Cyprus. It includes the flight and the honeymoon and the dress and everything. And then they come back and then they can actually be registered as married. And some people just don't do it because they are saying, as I said before, we're not going to do it. We're just going to live together, have kids until there is an option for civil marriage. So really in the last 10 years, you see a huge movement. It's a movement. And it's important to say that some people who belong to this movement are Orthodox Jews who do care deeply about halakha, about Jewish law, but basically see how much harm the Rabbanut is creating to Jewish tradition and Jewish law. So we kind of saw, especially with religion and state, how things gradually, but actually pretty quickly are changing around public transportation on Shabbat, around kashrut, and around marriages. And there are many other examples to really show how things change very quickly until we get to this point that the current government is prioritizing, for example, giving funding to organizations that do Jewish education, but not Orthodox. For example, Bina, that, as you know, I'm very close to. There are very optimistic opportunities now for organizations that basically do pluralistic Judaism, and it's very new. So I'm going to end, if I may, I started with a photo of me in India missing out. And basically, I'm going to show you something. Okay. So this is just last year from here, from Palo Alto. As you see, I'm wearing the protest shirt with my good friend Ophir, who started the Unacceptable movement that basically ran all over the Israeli communities around the world. So thanks to Ophir and thanks to amazing people, I didn't have to miss out this time. I wasn't in India, unfortunately. I was in Palo Alto, which is just as good. But we were able to be part of that. And I want to kind of end by saying that optimism is real. Sometimes it's hard to see. Sometimes it's really difficult with you know, all the frustration and things that you see. But some perspective really helps to see the change. And learning about that and kind of tracing that maybe can help us learn how to make change in our small communities, in our society, and to be inspired to do good in the world. So I want to thank you very much.
Thank you, Tovah. Thank you, Tovah, on behalf of New Lair House for this talk on such an important subject and bringing us connected closer to Israel, and we really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful winter break for those of you who are going away. And I hope to see you all very, very soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Tovah.
Thank you, Tovah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.